Welcome, friends, to Breakfast in the Ruins, a Michael Moorcock-flavoured podcast. This show is something of a bonus, following so hot on the heels of The Fortress of the Pale Part 2, but I had the opportunity to catch up with Oliver Brackenbury, editor of a new sword and sorcery magazine entitled New Edge. But what is it? This is from the back cover of issue 0. New Edge Sword and Sorcery takes the genre's virtues: outsider protagonists, thrilling energy, wondrous weirdness, and a large body of classic tales, then alloys inclusivity, mutual creator support, a positive fan community, and enthusiastic promotion of new works into the mix. Issue 0 is out already, and issues 1 and 2 are about to be kickstarted, so what better time to sit down with Oliver and talk Moorcock, genre fiction, a little bit of gaming, editing and constructing an all-new sword and sorcery anthology mag, and a few other things along the way. We're back in Derry Toms, and I'm very happy to have with me Oliver Brackenbury. Now, funnily enough, we have looked at anthologies very, very briefly when we had Andrew Nett on the show, and we talked about a book of essays that he did around Dangerous Visions and New Worlds, and we talked more broadly about anthology publications like New Worlds and Dangerous Visions. But I'm absolutely delighted to have Oliver here, because Oliver, writer, screenwriter, editor, podcaster, and editor of an all-new sword and sorcery anthology, New Edge. So welcome to Derry Toms, Oliver.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. And it's always great in this day and age when we've been through this period of Kindles and ebooks and PDFs. It feels like books are like vinyl and print is coming back in a big way. And the wonderful thing about New Edge Sword and Sorcery, of course we'll talk about that shortly, but issue 0 came out, the fall issue last year, was available in print, was available in hardcover, and you're just about to go out to Kickstarter on issue 1. But, as is generally the case on Breakfast in the Ruins, when we have a new guest, we always kick off by finding out what your background is with things like Moorcock, and particularly genre fiction. So, tell us, how on earth did you get into this position, and where did your interest start?
Well, there's a large gap. See, when I was young, I fell into Steve Jackson, Ian Livingstone's fighting fantasy books. That's the earliest fantasy I remember reading. Really loved adventuring through those. The Sorcery 4-parter mega story they did was a particular favorite. And I must have read The Hobbit. I know I did, and a few other sort of expected texts. But for whatever reason, when I was around 10 or 11, I was one of those kids who just felt compelled to pick a team between fantasy and science fiction. Don't ask me why. And don't ask me why I decided, science fiction is much more sophisticated, smash cut all kinds of awful crap. So I sort of fell in more with like William Gibson, cyberpunk and that kind of thing. And I was like, fantasy's childish, whatever. But it's like, give me a break. But, that's what I thought when I was like, wise and 10 or 11. But that just kind of continued for a long time. I mostly slid off of also a lot of sort of contemporary fantasy of the 90s. I don't know, the big sort of more epic high-style fantasy, more lots of love to the people who like it, but it kind of slides off me. And so I just sort of thought, broadly speaking, I guess fantasy isn't really for me. But there was a big exception to that would kind of come slamming right back into my life years later, which was I greatly enjoyed the Savage Sword of Conan comics, the reprints of the big magazine-size ones that were black and white and like a bit more adult. I didn't know to call it sword and sorcery or anything more separate at the time. I just was like, there's Conan, I like it. Fast forward many years to about, I guess 6 to 7 years ago now, and I'm living in Toronto, and I'm doing volunteer work with something that I think any listener would be interested in, because they do have digital stuff, but anybody in Toronto or planning to pass through Toronto at any point in their lives may be interested. It's called the Merril Collection. It has a longer name, I always bugger, but it's essentially a collection of speculative fiction, an archive running back 150 odd years. They have a first edition of Dracula, for example, and they have over 80,000 items. It originally began with a 5,000, I want to say, item donation in 1970 by famous editor Judith Merril. And it's just an incredible research tool. And also a lovely quiet place to get a bit of writing done, and that's when I first found it. And when I was there, I thought, I remember those Savage Sword of Conans I used to read. I should probably read the actual original bloody stories that the comics were riffing off of. So, I started reading with the Lancer paperbacks and all that stuff. And very quickly, I just fell deep, 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 deep down a well with Sword Sorcery and sort of the Appendix N reading list, from D&D, that, Gary Gygax, this whole thing of, the influences that allowed him to come up with D&D or co-create it. So yeah, and I just found, oh wait, this is the fantasy I was missing. I really enjoy fantasy tales that are grounded in characters who aren't necessarily trying to save the world, all capital letters, who have more personal, maybe even kind of like less noble motivations, but aren't fully, grim, dark, murderous bastards or whatever. And the sense of pre-codified fantasy. I really enjoy not having magic systems, having weird and wonderful creatures that feel unique and strange, not part of an ecosystem, just another weird animal. And magic that doesn't feel like another technology, but is dark and mysterious and frightening, and it comes at a terrible cost by and large. And that tends to be what you run into when you read fantasy pre-1980. There's exceptions to all of this, of course. I'm making broad statements, but I did find it quite a bit in Appendix N, and in particular in the Sword and Sorcery canon. And I spent the next few years with no plans to do anything with this knowledge. It was purely enjoyment. Just plowing through all the old texts I could find at the Merril Collection, and then secondhand bookstores I started raiding, and the disease got in my veins, and now I've got books all over the house in that genre. And it was lovely too, because I got into some of the scholarship, because the Merril has old like pulp magazines, so I could look at like some of the original publication versions and weird tales of some of these stories, and I could also find long out of print collections of nonfiction by big thinkers, including Moorcock. And the one that comes up to mind off the top of my head was Fafford and Me, a collection for its library's essays. And that was very interesting because they were from several decades of his life, and this is something I really enjoy, and one of the big pleasures of Moorcock, of him having been such a long running prolific author. I love seeing how authors' thoughts on their genre and then their writing, actual writing, evolves over time. I really, really enjoy that. And so it's been fun reading, I'm right in the middle right now of Citadel, the new Moorcock novel, The Network, and yet at the same time, I recently had a read of an essay he had in Amra, the fanzine, in '61, about this. I don't think he was even calling it Sword and Sorcery yet. So it's just, it's all fascinating. Anyway, that's a bit of an all over the show answer. Pardon me. The Kickstarter for issues 1 and 2 actually launches on Thursday, February 2nd. We're recording this on the Monday, and I have way too much caffeine in me to try and keep going, because it's been a lot to do. So I hope that's an adequate answer.
What a fantastic resource to have at your fingertips. Oh,
it's incredible. I'm just down the street from it. I couldn't ask for more. And the people who work there really know their stuff and have helped direct me to things I wouldn't have seen otherwise. And there's actually it's mostly books, obviously, but there's not a small amount of original art there that's quite fascinating. They can't quite cite the provenance, so I have to kind of put a disclaimer in front of this, but they have what they're pretty sure is original Clark Ashton Smith drawing, as well. So stuff like that you can be found there. And as I say, they have digitized some of the collection. So if you don't ever think you're going to go to Toronto, it's still worth Googling the Merril Collection, checking it out. And in fact, I did actually end up doing a podcast with them. I recently sort of stepped off because I'm busy now with the magazine, but I did 2 seasons of what's called Unknown Worlds of the Merril Collection. If you search for that anywhere you find podcasts, you'll find, I think we got up to 17 episodes on different aspects of genre fiction, including the Sword and Sorcery episode. And the most recent one, my sort of stepping off grand finale, was on climate fiction with Kim Stanley Robinson. I'm quite proud of that one. Well, I'm proud of all of them. So that's, I guess, to give an idea of how impressed I was by the place. I got sucked in, gave it many years of my life, and did all kinds of stuff, including the podcast. So great resource, and definitely where I feel like I got my, let's say, my bachelor's in Sword and Sorcery.
We'll put links to all those in the show notes when this goes out. It's interesting you should mention the development of writers as they go along over the course of their careers, because the last show that we put out just at the time of recording this was about The Fortress of the Pearl by Moorcock, and just how different it is and how developed the writing style is compared to his earlier, more urgent and vital style in the 1960s. But you also mentioned one of Moorcock's essays from 1961, and I was having a conversation with a friend of the show, Anthony Piconti, a couple of days ago, and we were talking about Sword and Planet as well as Sword and Sorcery, and I pulled out my Paizo Planet Stories edition of Surgeon the Swordsman, and he wrote that when he was 16 or 15 or something, and then only 5 years later he's writing essays for publication about the nature of Sword and Sorcery, and he's been the editor of Tarzan Monthly and all these different bits and pieces. Sometimes I have to pinch myself when we're actually talking about some of these stories, because when you hit grey, old, fat and 50 like I am, it's like when you see a sportsman and you realise he's only 22 and you think, oh shit, how old am I and how talented is he at his age? And it wasn't just Moorcock, but lots and lots of these authors were producing this incredible, vital, raw fantasy fiction at ridiculously young ages.
You know, we all come into our own whatever we do, however we do, and I would never try to diminish the talent of him or anyone else. But I think it's always worth kind of looking at what was the ecosystem in which these people were able to develop so quickly. You know, you're making me think of something stupid that's been doing the rounds on Twitter recently, where, you know, some idiot who has no thoughts about how art is produced was posting a picture of a classical Renaissance era statue, being like, so-and-so, I can't remember the name, sorry, but so-and-so made this at 23, what's stopping you? Like, what is the point of that, except to make people feel bad? And immediately anybody with any actual knowledge of art history would start dunking on him and saying, well, this person was raised from a young age by a master to be good at, sculpture, and had patrons so that he had to do nothing else with his life. That may have helped. I mean, there was also talent, but, and then I look back into what we're talking about with some of the sort of magazine writers, short story writers of the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, whatever, who these big talents we talk about, obviously actually genuinely quite talented, but also coming of age with their writing in an era when there was a much bigger, more vibrant, I think, literary scene, particularly when it comes to short stories and the lower stakes of short stories, and being able to just kind of fling your art out there and try things, and really try things. That's one thing I love about the short fiction magazine as a format. It's a great arena for people to experiment, try new characters without the same high stakes of, say, putting a couple of years into a novel and then praying it sells, enough copies to justify, you being picked up by the publisher again, kind of thing. So I do really, and also we're talking about back in the era, even to novels, when the midlist existed. Again, a great playground. I read about, I've read a lot of science fiction and fantasy from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. But the stuff that feels the most, out there to me is reading about publishers who would take on an author and who's pretty unknown and give them like a 3, 4, 5 book deal and go, who cares if the first book or two don't sell well? They'll find their feet. Maybe book 3 will do all right.
Yeah. That's what the publishing landscape was like in the UK around genre fiction. And I think it was the same in the States. I've often thought that, I remember when I used to try and find these things on eBay, and you would not be able to find anything that was in print in the UK, but you'd get it from the States. Because the States is so massive, you can have an independent publisher like Nightshade Press or someone like that, for example, who will pick up something that's been out of print for years, and they will publish it, and enough people will buy it to make it worth their while, which has been an absolute treasure over the years. And I really regret not getting their Clark Ashton Smith collection in hardcover. I got the reissue paperbacks, but the hardcovers look beautiful. But that's just me as a collector being a nerd. But all of the books that I used to have that were given to me by my granddad, when I got rid of 2/3 of them and took them to effectively charity shops to get rid of them, apart from a handful that I gave to friends who wanted them, most of those were printed in the 60s or 70s by US or British publishers. And the really tragic thing is most of them will have been out of print since the editions that I've got, because so many obscure authors, I mean, who the fuck is going to republish Spearmen of Arn or something like that these days? Or all of those books are now lost to me, and I am going out of my way to try and replace them, much to Phil's chagrin when it comes to actually space in the house. But lots and lots and lots of them are just, if you can track them down on eBay, then you're fortunate, but they'll never be reprinted. And it's like they're treasure. So it's really satisfying that, because of things like, I don't know, social media, Twitter, making connections, and actually the podcast scene as well as a strong role in this, because I don't think you or I would have ever had a conversation if it wasn't for listening to certain podcasts which connect the dots and connect people together, has really made this whole scene of interest in all these things more vibrant. And because I follow certain accounts on Twitter, you come across things like New Edge Volume 0, which I think I said to you when we emailed. I picked it up in December, then forgot about it, forgot where I've put it. And now I went to Amazon, because, of course, what we can say is they're at cost on Amazon in print.
Yeah, it's only $3.99 US for the soft cover. Because issue 0, like, it's not sustainable. We can't keep it at those prices. But yeah, and the hardcover is $11.99, and the digital is free, which is why it's sold off of Amazon. Amazon would not let me price it at 0. Right. But oh well. yeah, the issue zero was still is a passion project, prototype, promotional tool essentially. Because when I approached the people I collaborated with on it back in sort of June of last year, I said, "Look, I don't have money, but what I do have is experience with large scale collaborative artistic projects." A passion for doing this, I've got everything but the money, And they said, okay, fine, we'll take a chance on it. I said, okay, but here's the thing, you don't want to you run into this a lot in independent film where I have some experience where you get people saying, come and work on my thing for free, and that'll earn you the chance to work on my next thing for free. Fuck off. So, sorry, pardon me, I don't know what your stance is on cursing.
You could get exposure.
Yeah, exactly. So I didn't want to pull that one on them. So I said, look, guys, here's the deal. I'm going to do this issue zero as a test to see, can I even do it? If I do it, will I like it? All that kind of stuff. And that's why, one of the reasons why I didn't do open submissions, because I wanted to keep it manageable. And why I did Amazon POD, because I didn't want to also take on the task of figuring out how to print professionally, as we were going to be doing with the Kickstarter. So I just kept it focused on the magazine, did that over the course of the summer, got it out at the end of September. And the point was, well, okay, I can't sell this for money if I ask the people to do it for free. That's obscene. And it'd be better to do it for free or at cost, which is the absolute minimum Amazon will let me sell. Like, you're just paying for Amazon's production and shipping if you do that. But that's good because I want to get it out and try and build an audience, because I was already thinking ahead and going, if I like this enough, I want to keep doing it. And if I want to keep doing it, my ethos is to pay contributors as much as possible and run it as a business, not a hobby. Not because I expect to get rich from it. My God, it's independent publishing. But because in order to keep it viable, you have to be able to pay the contributors enough to keep coming back and to keep them doing what they're doing, but also yourself, because if life gets stressful and you've got a big thing you're doing in your spare time, the thing that doesn't bring in money is the first thing that collapses. And if that collapses, well, then I'm not paying the contributors anymore. They're not going to be in the magazine because the magazine's folded. So I'm trying to be sensible about how I go about it while still keeping a focus on, quality stories, good art, all that stuff that we, enjoy as readers. Because, I want to make the kind of thing I'd want to read, cliche, but true.
Well, as it happens, I bought 3 more copies, and then I found the copy that I bought in December. But those 3 copies will be going out to patron demons, so we'll draw a couple of numbers towards the end, and then we'll find out who's picked those up, and I'll send them out. What I probably should have done was wait until we picked some numbers, because then I could have ordered them on Amazon and just got them sent straight to people. But that's just me being a dullard at the end of the day. Now, you mentioned earlier on that you get these things on Twitter. It's like, such and such did X. What are you doing with your life? And the answer is usually because I'm a fucking schlub and I like talking about these things. I'm not a writer and I'm not going to get involved in those kind of things. So how did you end up being actually on the other side of that equation and writing fiction and writing screenplays?
Oh, God. I mean, so I'll try not to give you my whole life story, because I'm one of those annoying, precocious kids who was like dictating stories to his mum before he could actually write his alphabet. So it was from an early age. But the less precious answer, I mean, honestly, I was always writing in some form or another. Classic, origin story. I got into role playing games. Although funny enough, I didn't play D&D until I was in my late 20s. It was Shadowrun and some other stuff. But anyway, a bit of Call of Cthulhu actually as well. But point is, whatever. So role playing games were an expression, but I was writing short stories for fun and tried to write a novel which had a love interest. I was in high school, had a love interest that bore a suspicious resemblance to a girl I fancied. Didn't go anywhere. And the novel, all that. And then it started to coalesce a bit more as I went into university, and I was getting an English degree because I knew writing and reading was just my life as in terms of what I loved. And I thought very visually, and I thought, well, okay, I would also like to make a living so I can make it what I do all the time. And I started looking at screenwriting, and that was sort of a long road. It took a while to find an entryway there, because I came from a family with no connections and not no real money, which play important roles. We like to think it's a meritocracy where anybody who just writes a good enough script comes in and conquers the world, but nope. Once in a while that happens, but it's an exception, not the rule. Anyway, whatever. Like I say, my life story. So fast forwarding through my 20s, doing short films and web series, collaborating with my peers, making stuff. Eventually got to go into a prestigious television development program through the National Screen Institute in Canada, and that's been helpful. But it's bloody hard to get a TV show made. I'm at a point right now where I've got two projects that have been going along for a while and might blossom this year. Fingers crossed. We'll see, but that's all I can say. And I have been lucky enough to get paid for my work a few times, so that's nice. Not everybody writes screenplays and saying that, but it's not my full-time career. I wish it was. In the meanwhile, I chose a few years back to write a novel, in part because I had an idea I really wanted to write, of course, but also because one of the real bummers of screenwriting is you can put a novel's worth of effort into a feature film or a TV pilot, screenplay, that kind of thing, and then like maybe a couple dozen people read it. Some friends, if you're lucky, some executives will read it and ponder paying you for it. But then nobody picks it up. And wow, that was a novel that 12 to 24 people or whatever read. That's not a lot. Even for the most unsuccessful self-pub rush jobs tend to get more than that. And so I just thought, God, all right, well, I'm going to write something where, I can get it out there at least a bit more. And I did okay. Got a small publisher to pick up my first novel, Junkyard Leopard. I tried self-pub because I was curious about that for my second novel. Felt a bit like a big blog post, but I don't think I had a good approach to it. I know it works for some people. It didn't work for me, at least on that book. And so after that, I thought, God, what can I do that's different? At that point, I felt like I'd done a lot of creative things for the sake of doing them, and I was no longer satisfied with that. If I was going to do something creative, whether it was my third novel or this magazine, for example, I just thought, I want to actually try and make it as successful as I can without setting like unrealistic, I'll conquer the world or I'll be very sad, expectations. And so with the novel, I thought I'd try something different. I was curious about podcasting. I, at that point, had done a few episodes of the one I mentioned earlier for the Friends of Merril. And I thought, hey, what if I do my own podcast? I'll call it So I'm Writing a Novel. And it's like behind the scenes following me as I write my third novel, a sword and sorcery novel, which is my pretending I've had a long career like Moorcock or like Libra had, where you get those stitch ups, right, of story where they continuity gets forced onto it by picking up all the stories that were published everywhere. So I'm just writing it as 17 short stories, but with the sort of the illusion that they've been written over decades and they're being stitched together into So yeah, I'm having fun with that. It's about 3/4 of the way outlined, and I outline in such detail the drafts come quick, so you could argue it's 3/4 written. And I've really enjoyed the podcast, and it's been a great way to meet people. And in fact, several of the writers in issue 0 of New Edge Sword Sorcery are people I'd interviewed already on that podcast, because if I'm not talking about my novel, I'm interviewing people on there. And then that connected me to the Whetstone Magazine Discord, which is where I sort of met the real sword and sorcery scene, I would argue. I mean, it's in a bunch of places online. You have a lot of Facebook groups and so on, but honestly, the most vibrant, my favorite place to discuss the genre is the Discord server for Whetstone Magazine. For those who are listening and don't know what I'm talking about, Whetstone is a wonderful magazine put out of the States. It's for free, digital only. And the whole idea of it is to give amateur authors a chance to get their sort of early publications, get their first crack, or for more experienced authors to kind of muck about, again, low stakes, like I was saying earlier, and try something completely different or new or whatever. I'm lucky I had a story in issue 6, actually, the most recent one called Hunter, that I'm quite proud of. But the Discord for that is a wonderful place online. That was actually where the discussions back in the spring about, because, you get these cyclical discussions in niche subgenres of like, how do we make this thing bigger? Sword and Sorcery was big in the 30s, and then it was big again, sort of 60s through mid 80s. It's been fallow, but it's kind of coming back, and it feels like, could we get it to a third wave? Can we get that? And so I don't know what was different about this particular conversation this spring, but something gave it an energy I hadn't seen before. And it was like just 3 days of just waking up and going, I'm typing, and, and really going mad, discussing, how can we make it bigger? How do we get younger readers in? How do we make it more inclusive? Because, no maliciousness. I'm just saying, the audience of Sword and Sorcery is somewhat homogenous at the moment. It is largely sort of, 35 plus white guys. And, some of my best friends are, I'm one of them. But it's like, we got to expand. If we want to make it bigger, you got to bring everybody in. And even if there's no maliciousness, if people who are not part of that demographic look over and see pretty much just that demographic, you can't blame them for thinking, oh, well, maybe that's not for me, or maybe I'm not welcome. So that was part of the conversation, was like, how do we break out of this sort of homogeneity? And so by the end of all those conversations, and I started talking to people, I was thinking, I'd had ideas for a magazine 2 years prior, but it wasn't focused enough. So I put that idea down. And now I thought, well, here's a focus, here's an energy. I'd like to make a magazine, Sword and Sorcery. I want to try and contribute to making this thing bigger. And I like more variety, and not just in the diversity of the authors and their characters, though that is of course important to me, but also just variety and storytelling, because I think Sword and Sorcery is an incredibly flexible genre. You can make it very recognizable as what it is, but do a lot within that. I'm a big fan of. Have you ever read Brian Murphy's book, Flame and
No.
Crimson: A History of Sword and Sorcery?
No.
Okay, well, I think lots of other people, including say Howard Andrew Jones, have written excellent definitions of the genre. Other people have written about it, but my personal favorite is Brian Murphy's book. It's a wonderful piece of genre history if you want to read all about sword and sorcery from birth, actually a little before its birth through to sort of lying fallow in the 80s and now what's going to happen next. Great book. And his definition in it, what I like about it most is it is flexible. He outlines 7 things that you tend to come across in sword and sorcery. Short episodic stories, more cosmic, Lovecraftian kind of weird horror. Like I was saying earlier, not so much the codified thing where it's a werewolf, shoot it with a silver bullet or whatever.
Yeah.
Outside of protagonist, personally motivated, all this good stuff. And it's like 7 kind of posts marking the boundaries. But the way I like to describe it is I say, to me, this is me putting my words in Brian's mouth, I say, like, imagine it almost like a really berserk wrestling ring where you have these 7 posts and they go, okay, here's the boundaries, but running between them is really elasticated rope that can be stretched and pushed out and leapt off of and done all kinds of cool things. And so that was something else I wanted because I enjoy a good Conan pastiche or Conan riff as much as anyone, but you do sometimes run into people who like the subgenre for whom that's all there is, and anything different isn't, So I want to see what I can do to push the storytelling as well as, say, the variety of the audience and the readership and the writership. And so that was the mission with the magazine. I said, okay, somebody said, oh, Oliver, you should do an anthology. I said, I'd rather do a magazine, but would anybody help me? Because that's a huge task. And to my delight, quite a few people on the Whetstone server went, yeah. And so I lucked into a wonderful sort of, volunteer staff. I've got a layout and design guy, a social media person. Thank goodness I could not do that on top of the magazine. A copy editor. So I'm really happy for that because quality is very important to me. My parents are both goldsmiths, actually. Came over from England and then had me in Canada. Growing up with craftspeople as parents, even if you yourself don't go into a trade like that, it will kind of make you care more about doing it right. Not being a perfectionist, not, perfect is the enemy, good and done, right? But just appreciating attention to detail, really thoughtfulness going into something. And I've tried to bring that into the magazine. And I was very happy to get the copy editor on board. Of course, that really helped with it. And then we spent the summer making the thing. And well, I'm back to where I started again. Pardon me. I've been thinking so hard about this thing practically all day, every day since June. I sometimes get a bit circular in my speaking about it. So feel free to cut in. I will not be offended.
No, that's absolutely fine. That's absolutely fine. I think fantasy fiction, people get hung up on classifications like whiskey. Is it medicinal or is it peaty? Or heavy metal? Is it, oh God, so many classifications of heavy metal. Yeah. Is it doom or is it stoner or is it grindcore or mathcore or whatever the fuck these things mean? I ain't got a clue. But if it's loud and it's chunky and it's got a good drive and it's got a good groove, it'll do me. But when you say that you're setting out to do specifically a sword and sorcery magazine, are there any boundaries to that? Okay, let's put Tolkien pastiche aside with dwarves and elves and everything else. You've talked about being more broad in the definitions, but where does sword and sorcery stop and become something else?
Well, I mean, you mentioned heroic fantasy, and I think right there, that's an easy one. It's the motivation. Right, one of the authors I was lucky enough to get in issue 0, who will be returning for issue 1 or 2. I haven't figured out who goes in which issue yet, by and large, is David C. Smith. And he wrote a series of Great Red Sonja books with oh God, I'm going to bugger it, Turney. It was the last name of the author he co-authored them with. And has done a bunch of other sword and sorcery, including quite recently, actually, an excellent novel called Sometime Lofty Towers. But he also wrote back in the day, at the beginning of his career, a series around a character called Auron, and he himself would tell you, well, that's heroic fantasy. And you look at it, and it seems to have a lot of the same trappings of a sword and sorcery, and it does. But at the end of the day, it's a character who's out to, it's sort of big, high world ending stakes and heroic motivations, and that's the difference for me right there. Sword and sorcery, you can have characters do things that are noble or be heroic in some ways, but it can't be, I would argue, necessarily what the story's about. But then, I come back to something I don't think I've properly elaborated on, Brian Murphy's definition. Like I said, he mentioned 7 aspects that you tend to run into, but this is the wisdom of his definition and why I hew so closely to it. The wisdom of his definition is he says, look, you don't need all 7 things. And he doesn't say how many things you need. He doesn't say it has to be 4 or 5 or whatever. He just says, look, here's the 7 things you tend to run into with the genre. If there's enough in there for you, the reader, to feel like, yeah, this is sword and sorcery, congratulations, you're reading sword and sorcery. And I really like that flexibility. I really like putting a bit of power in the reader and just saying, look, man, it's a feeling. And there's a few things that do feel wildly out of place, and you'll probably get pushback on them. Like if it's a story about a group, a fellowship, if you will, traveling to save the world. Well, it's probably not sword and sorcery, but but there's just a lot of room within that. And there are stories that at a glance you would never think of sword and sorcery, but then you work through Brian's checklist. Like I was recently on the Elder Sign podcast, and we discussed The Dark Eidolon by Clark Ashton Smith. And that's it's big, wild, more is more, lots of crazy magic and madness, revenge story, basically. But I worked through Brian's checklist out of curiosity, and it nailed all 7. And I just thought, that was deeply satisfying, because I thought it was, it felt like sword and sorcery to me, but then I just kind of ran it through this kind of thing, and it worked perfectly. And so there you go, right? So it's this funny thing where I think you have to have some genre definition, because if you don't draw any lines, you have a blank page, you have nothing. But I like the idea of those lines having some bend. And at the end of the day, you instead of being prescriptive to others and using genre definition as a cause for argument, as opposed to, say, interesting discussion, when there is a difference, I just think use it as a guiding light to help express yourself, whether just in quotation marks as a reader, expressing how you feel about it, what you enjoy, or as a writer, of course, expressing your writing, or as an editor trying to guide his magazine. And because I do like to, in the summer with the authors, I did really like to, if I could, time zones, etc., have a phone call or a web call with them and be like, hey, what got you excited about your story? What was the theme or the image or the line? And what is your goal? Like, I do try to work with the authors to strengthen and sort of megaphone their voice, not to put mine over top. But at the end of the day, I'm the editor. It's my magazine. Of course, my ideas and thoughts on this whole genre are shaping it, which is part of why I guess I'm here to explain, what's this magazine going to give you? And so, issue 0 has some of what you might call very traditional sword and sorcery, although still with some little tweaks to it. And then it has, for example, one story I really wanted to make sure I kind of went outside the scene for at least one author. So long story short, I picked up an author, TK Rex, who came in and did a story that to some people wouldn't be sword and sorcery. And I certainly feel it definitely pushes those elasticator ropes I was describing earlier about as far as any of the stories in the issue does, dealing with themes that you don't run into as much in sword and sorcery, like environmentalism. But I'm here for it because it was an experiment. I'm really glad I did, and I do want to keep bringing in the real SNS people for writing it, of course. But I want to keep looking to people in other genres and other places. Taya, that's the T in TK Rex. She's written fantasy. I read a fantasy story of hers that partly made me think, oh, let's get her on board. But she definitely thinks a lot about science. And that comes through in the story. Or, horror authors are a natural go-to for sword and sorcery, of course, because of the overlap from the dawn of the genre back in weird fiction. And so, I want to look at more horror authors. I'll be bringing some of them in for issues 1 and 2. There's Canadian author Gemma Files, who's quite excellent at horror, and I'm very happy to have her on board. So, and I've honestly, I don't know that I'll get the chance to act on it with these issues. I'm talking with one author. We're still figuring it out. But romance, I think, has incredible overlap with sword and sorcery. Think about stories. Let's go to a real big classic one, People of the Black Circle by Robert E. Howard, that Conan story, which is sort of set in not Afghanistan / kind of India. But it's all about him falling in love with essentially the Devi Yasmina princess over the course of it. But by the end, spoiler for an almost 100-year-old story, close your ears if you don't want to hear this for 30 seconds. At the end, they want to be with each other, but their responsibilities to their respective people, mean they have to part ways. But they part ways in this wonderful way of just showing mutual respect and going, "Oh, well, we'll do battle with our armies later." Not doing it justice. Point is, I love that story, and I know I'm not the only person who's thought, "Oh, but what if they did stay together and had adventures, and what would that be like? What if Conan actually stayed with any of the women he meets for more than one story? And what if we got to explore that relationship?" And I know I'm not alone in that, because not only from talking to people and just other fellow fans, Lynn Carter and Sprague de Camp, and I want to say, one of the guys they brought in late on the Lance.
Bjorn Nyberg.
Yeah, Bjorn Nyberg. Didn't they do a novel-length story which had kind of a vignette in it where the Devi Yasmina shows up again, and Conan and her have a little romantic reunion for one night, and they finally get to sleep together, which was one of the they sort of blue-balled each other over People of the Black Circle and never got to consummate. And so there you go, right? The two of the biggest fanboys in the history of Conan, because Carter and de Camp wanted to see that. 50 odd years ago, whatever that was. And so I just think, yeah, romance actually has a lot of overlap, I think, with Sword and Sorcery. And so, yeah, I'll go on whole tirade about that if I don't stop myself. Point is, this is to further illustrate what I'm saying. I think you can do so much with it. It's so exciting. And I hope that we fund issues 1 and 2 so we can get to do more stuff in there, and I can kind of demonstrate what I'm talking about more than just yapping on. Although, God, I do love the sound of my own voice. Pardon me. Again, I feel like I'm talking.
No, it's fantastic. Podcast is an audio medium, isn't it? So we want that content. But one of the reasons I love Sword and Sorcery, and I would say I prefer it to, in inverted commas, heroic fantasy, is because it's grounded. Because people want to get through today. If they do get money, they've lost it by the start of the next story. If they get treasure, and actually, you mentioned fighting fantasy books earlier on, and this is why my taste in role-playing games tends towards that end as well. I don't want to be a fighter with a stronghold with 120 million gold pieces in a chest. I want my characters to finish one story, and they may have riches and treasures, but the next story, I want them to be a bum. You know, I want them to have lost everything or have gambled everything because they live, they love, they fight, yada yada.
Have you played Dungeon Crawl Classic Lankmar?
No, but my mum and dad got me it for Christmas last year, the year before last, and I still haven't opened the box.
Well, I mentioned it just because you would really like, going by what you were telling me, the fact that it has luck as an attribute in that comes and goes much quicker than it does in regular DCC. Yeah. You're very much in. It helps get you the kind of Fafnir Grey Mouse or somewhat more swashbuckling tone by having it come and go easily and encouraging players to take wild chances, swing off the chandelier and kick the guy in the face kind of stuff. Yeah. And after an adventure, if you've lost a lot of luck and you're kind of low, you can try and regain it by just blowing your money, because the whole point is that you guys are like Fafnir Grey Master and you kind of lose most of your money between adventures. And it's got huge tables on how that will happen. And by the end of the result, you not only lose your money, but you tend to get a fun story hook to slingshot you into the next adventure.
Oh, nice.
So, it's very much like, you slept with the wrong noble and now the palace guard is chasing you. You dropped your purse on the way out of the palace, that kind of thing. It's really fun. And you'll like it, I think.
Well, that sounds fantastic, because they're actually gamifying some of the little elements of that kind of stuff that I really, really enjoy. And that sounds great.
Yeah. Well, the DCC guys, like Goodman Games, I mean, they're great and they really get it. They're part of what got me down this path, not only because I actually became aware of the Appendix N, not through D&D, but through Dungeon Crawl Classics, which is rooted in the Appendix N literature, and they do a wonderful job of having information at the back of the main rulebook, but also on their website, their socials. They are always educating people about that reading list, that body of work, which I think is great. And have ads for the Appendix N Book Club podcast, of course. It's a great resource. It's right there in the title. And so that actually was a big part of what got me down the road. And then they publish what I enjoy many magazines, but I think the premier one, and I don't know that anybody would argue with me about this, is Tales from the Magician's Skull, which is published by Goodman Games. It's edited by Howard Andrew Jones, wonderful guy I've gotten the privilege of getting to know over the last couple of years. And part of the fun of the the issues, and this is part of what grabbed me. I actually bought my first copy, issue number 3, at a gaming store, which stocked it, in part because Goodman Games publishes it, but also because they have this fun thing where in the back of it they'll have stats for the monsters and the magical items or whatever oddness that you run into in the stories that you've enjoyed reading. Which is a fun trick, even if you never do anything with it in your games. It's just fun. Yeah. And I think they used to do that, or at least to some degree, in Dragon Magazine back in the day, but I could be misremembering. Anyway, so and that magazine has been kind of my North Star, because I really like what they do in terms of, come back to what I was saying earlier about craft and quality. They really, really care about the physical object. And until recently, when I guess COVID paper shortages things got in the way, their first 6 issues, I want to say, were printed on this lovely kind of parchment paper that made you feel like you were picking up, a classic pulp magazine from back in the day. And I think I've got the privilege, I've got access to an archive where I can actually touch those old pulp magazines. So I'll tell you, they got it. And so, that has been kind of my North Star in terms of quality and what I'm aspiring to with New Edge Sword and Sorcery. The print on demand I thought came out pretty well. But the new challenge for me this time around is I'm not doing open subs yet. But this time I did the research, found someone who knew more than me, of course, which is a good thing to do, listeners. If you ever go on a big creative project, find people who know more than you do. We're going to be working with a proper printer. And if we hit certain stretch goals, we'll get to upgrade the hardcover to be even sexier with ribbon bookmarks and foil embossed cover. And if we really blow the roof off, I might add colored end pages on there, which for anyone who's not familiar with the term end pages, you know, when you get an old paperback and it's got like yellow, purple, red, green, whatever along the edges of the pages, I could maybe do that if we if it does really well. Because yeah, I love the book as object. I love it so much.
It's funny you should mention that. I got my broken binding edition of Citadel of Forgotten Myths, and that's got the lovely page edges.
Yeah, with the painted sword. I love it.
Yeah, it's nice, isn't it?
Oh, and there's Symbols of Chaos on top and bottom.
Yeah,
brilliant.
Quite pleased with that. If anybody's listening, check out the Broken Binding in the UK. They're doing some lovely stuff. But before we come back to New Edge Sword and Sorcery, you mentioned something about the Conan stories and De Camp, Carter, and Bjorn Nyberg writing basically fan fiction, where they wanted Conan and his character to kind of get their due a little bit, rather than, you know, Robert E. Howard, well, it's over now, move on.
Yeah.
They've done that a lot in the comics, particularly the Dark Horse comics. There was a whole run with the Queen of the Black Coast character, where
that they got her own series.
Yeah, they went on for ages with like original stories to try and connect the dots. I don't think they were entirely successful, but it is kind of always interesting when people try to expand the Conan mythos. I don't think they're always particularly successful, but I just thought I'd recall that because I did read it about 6 months ago. I was collecting the Dark Horse collections, which ran well up until when Dark Horse lost it and it moved over to Marvel, and I've not read any of the new Marvel Conan adaptations, but I think they've lost it again now as well, and I think it's going elsewhere again.
It's moved on to, oh gosh, you know, I can't bloody remember. I know the author that's going to be taking over, or has taken over, and his stories are coming out soon, Jim Zub. He's a real talent, also out of Toronto, a good old Canadian.
Right.
Pardon me, sorry, listener. But yeah, I can't remember who has it now. Pardon me. I just think of Titan, but that's unrelated. That's to do with the new Conan novel by Jim Sterling. Yeah, no, I'm sorry. Pardon me. I can't remember.
No, I was just became aware of it the other day, but I never.
But yeah, no, it is fun to stitch things together, right? I mean, and I think it can be enjoyable. Certainly, I mean, here I am reading the new Moorcock novel. Why not? Let's cram a little bit more into his gap year or whatever. Between I think it can be quite enjoyable. It's funny. I read. Bring around to Moorcock. Why not? Seems like the podcast. I read the first 6 Elric books in paperbacks I hunted down. So I read them in sort of, I was all on the young Moorcock streak. And then it was around the time I found and enjoyed Stormbringer that they announced the big hardcover collections that they've just come out with. And I always mess up the company name. Sorry, everyone. I'm bad for names today. It's Saga, right?
Saga, yeah.
I think it's Tor, but maybe it's a partnership with Tor anyway.
Tor have been publishing some of his newer novels. I think they're publishing The Woods of Arcady this year, which is the sequel to The Whispering Swarm. But yeah, it was Saga Press, which I think is part of Simon & Schuster.
Yes, it is. Yeah, you're right.
The Elric collections.
Yeah, I think I've misspoken a few times and called it a Tor thing. Anyway, I picked up the first 2 volumes of that and rather enjoyed reading stuff that wasn't from those first 6 ones, like Fortress of the Pearl.
Yeah.
And I have talked to people for whom those collections have been their first exposure. And it is interesting to hear them talk about the kind of weird, almost tonal whiplash you get going from, Elric of Melniboné, sort of young Moorcock, but not the youngest Moorcock of Elric. And then, Fortress of the Pearl, we're leaping forward to 89.
Yep.
And then back and forth and back. Well, now it's Revenge of the Rose, 91. I wonder what that's like. I'd waited a little longer, I suppose I would have had the same experience.
I do wonder about that myself, because we've talked about it quite a lot. To jump from... Elric of Melniboné, even compared to the fix-up novels that were consisted of short stories that he originally published in the early 60s, Elric of Melniboné, even though it's a fast read, it's still a slightly more considered pace than something like a story like The Dreaming City. And certainly Stormbringer, which is a fix-up, I think, of 3 of the stories. I'd
have to look it up.
To go from Elric of Melniboné to The Fortress of the Pearl, because we've just revisited The Fortress of the Pearl, and I'll be repeating myself because we'll just put that episode out, but it is very, very different, and it's more of a piece with Dragon in the Sword, with City in the Autumn Stars, and with Revenge of the Rose. and it sits much more neatly and consistently with them than it does with really any of the Elric stories that were written in the 60s and 70s. But I think I've appreciated that more, and I've appreciated the qualities of that story more reading it now compared to when I read it in 1989 when it came out. And I think my eyes rolled into the back of my head because it wasn't chopping enough people's heads off, and the way it stuck in enough souls and everything else. When I was 17 years old, that's what I wanted.
Well, of course, yeah, we all have different priorities, different ages, and also it does bring me around to something I think about a lot with Sword and Sorcery and trying to reinvigorate it, bring it to a new popularity, which is that what role does our affection for these characters and these authors play in our appreciation of some of these works and our being fine with the whiplash of going back and forth through their careers, or we want to read the thing in linear order, but we know, okay, sure, it's going to go from the Demesne, which is one tone, to Pearl, which is another, and Bane of the Black Sword. Oh wow, okay, we're never going back to more heads getting chopped off and so on. Like that affection, I think, guides us through our continuing to dig into these authors and to being okay with, say, something like that leaping up and down around in tone and so on across the career of a character if we read them in linear as opposed to publication order, and gives us the endurance, one would even say, to go through the many different editions and hunting through the secondhand stores and so on. But I think something that holds this genre back at times, and I'm trying very hard to work around it, is that's a lot of work to ask of someone who wanders in and goes, well, I've watched a few episodes of Game of Thrones, what's this about? I think we really need to be welcoming and understanding for the casuals, the normies, as I joke, with no shade, because you can't expect everyone to be into everything. And I think if we want to make this thing bigger and more popular, you've got to try and make it appealing without watering down what the thing is. And so I think that's, what do you, and without making it seem like too onerous to get into it, because even if you're not being an outright intentionally obnoxious gatekeeper, some archetype out of a 90s film of a record store clerk being annoying, oh, you don't know that already. Even if you're not doing that more obviously obnoxious thing, it can be difficult not to meet someone and go, oh, you like something vaguely relevant to this thing I love, and then just drown them in too much detail and make it sound like it's a lot of work. So I guess that's part of the reason why I'm splitting the magazine between contemporary stories, new stories, and having nonfiction, which does try to teach a bit of that past, but we put that after the stories because I want to have the new stuff kind of invigorate the interest of stuff that you can go into without having to do any homework. And then in the back have an article being like, all right, here's how you want to read Elric. Here's how to make sense of the publication. Here's how you want to go, diving through the secondhand stores. I don't know. How do you feel about that with sort of your love of Moorcock's work, which, I mean, I couldn't be a bigger fan of, and I should probably mention at some point, really lucky, we've got him for issue 1, a new original story.
Which is fantastic.
I don't know if it'll be Elric or Corum or some whole new thing. I can't tell you what it's going to be, but it is going to be a new original story, not an excerpt from an upcoming work or a reprint or anything like that. And I just feel so lucky. And when I mentioned that to one or two people in private, leading up to now, and they said, oh, wow, geez, how'd that happen? Honestly, I wish it was a more exciting story. It just amounts to me being lucky enough to have had a friend with his email. I dared to write him and just very, I tried to not be too worshipful. That's off-putting. I just kind of was like, oh, hi, I got a new magazine, I'm hoping the title vaguely makes you think a new world. Do you want to do a story? And he just responded the next day, very enthusiastically, yeah.
Brilliant.
And I sort of pinched myself. I actually had to check again a couple of weeks ago. I was like, are you still, when you want to, because I'm about to do all this promo and tell people, and I'm worried. We said, oh, yeah. So, oh, bless him, and it was also funny because it's how I learned he likes to go by Mike, which felt downright disrespectful. No, it's Mr. Michael Moorcock. Yeah. And then those emails are just Mike. And it was after I first got an email that taught me that I read that AMRA essay that we mentioned earlier, and to my amusement, it's all typed out in Courier font or whatever typewriter was getting Xeroxed for AMRA. But at the end, it's a big handwritten Mike. So I was like, yeah, okay, that's how he's been going his whole life. All right, okay, I'll try to get used to it. But yeah. So gosh, I mean, I couldn't be luckier there. And I'm very excited to have him on board, of course. And I'm very excited because I found an artist who I think will be a great match to his stories, his kind of his later style. To bring it back to looking at Mike, I sound so casual, Michael, Mr. Moorcock, come on, to his style as it is now. Yeah. And that's something else I'm very proud of the magazine. Actually, lots of good art, which is part of the fun, isn't it, of the genre? I think, absolutely. Obviously, we all think of Frank Frazetta. I mean, he's the guy, but there's so many others. Although, fun fact, Sarah Rosetta, his granddaughter, is going to do a bit of art for the magazine,
Oh, lovely.
which is fun. Yeah, I mean, she doesn't pretend to be her grandfather. Don't put those kind of expectations. That's unfair on literally anyone.
Yeah.
But she does enjoy that, and she does manage her grandfather's art and estate and that kind of thing. So I thought it'd be kind of fun. I mean, I could have Rosetta and Moorcock in a magazine.
Well, what a scoop!
Yeah, have those two last names together in a thing. That's kind of cool.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm really proud of the art, and yeah, we're going to have original painted covers for issue 1 and 2. We're going to have original black and white illustrations for all the stories and most of the nonfiction. And our very first stretch goal will be to double the illustrations, so 2 for every story and most of the nonfiction, which I, as an editor, would love, because I always want to have an illustration at the beginning of the story, like a cover page. But then you don't want to have something too spoilery if it's that. So if I can get 2 illustrations per story, great. Title page sort of thing for each story, and then something interior nested within it, with the horrible reveal near the end or whatever. Anyway, pardon me, it keeps coming back to the magazine. What can I say? I'm here to pitch. Where was I? Moorcock, different editions. Oh, geez. Yeah, well, right. Talking about getting people in and the battle of like the love of how we get lost in these details of publication order and style and learning, but not wanting to make that into like this thing we have fun swimming in. We don't want to turn it into a moat that keeps out new people, lest we starve the thing to death.
Yeah, I think it's very much a modern reader thing, where people want to read things in the chronological order for the character. And because I run a Michael Moorcock flavoured podcast, people will sometimes ask me on Twitter, what's the best order to read X? And often people, will point people to really interesting articles that people have written. John Davey did an Elric Reader's Guide at one point. But my response is always the order in which you find them in a second-hand shop is the right order to read them in. Because when I was a kid, it didn't matter if you were reading Conan novels. I mean, if you read, I think the Centenary Conan collection, they're in the order in which they were written. They're not put into chronological order. And that suits me absolutely fine, because I read them piecemeal. And it didn't really matter to me what age Conan was over the course of that story. It was a Conan story. There's a level of interest attached to, I don't know, I always get the names mixed up, because it was a Cole story rewritten for Conan. Was it The Phoenix on the Sword? I can't remember.
Correct.
Yes, Phoenix on the Sword, which I think was a rewrite of By This Axe I Rule, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was, yeah.
So you read that, it's, all right, Conan's mature. He's got a kingdom. That's fascinating. But the next one you read is Tara the Elephant and is a teenager. It doesn't matter. And I'm the same with the Elric stories. And ultimately, I don't think it really matters if you read the Elric stories out of order. Okay, you might read a story where he's got Moonglim with him. Well, so what? It doesn't really matter. The order is immaterial. Essentially, there are pulp adventure novels. I read Stormbringer before I read any of the others.
Because, well, there you go.
Yeah, because my granddad, Pops, gave me tons of books, but the first 2 Moorcock books I got were Warlord of the Air and Stormbringer. I'll be boring the listeners shitless because I've said this so many times, but the Stormbringer Pocketbooks edition with the Jack Garn cover with his kinky boots and his pixie hat, the cover that Moorcock hated, that was my first 50-50, my first ever Moorcock story. I can't remember which one I read first. Holy shit, the character is impaled on his own sword at the end, and the sword runs off laughing. It's like, what the fuck am I reading? Doesn't matter. Yeah. But I can appreciate, perhaps, that if you were a completely new reader to Elric and you read everything in order and you could get over the hump of Fortress of the Pearl and then go back to Sailor on the Seas of Fate and then the raw vitality of the stories in Weird of the White Wolf and some of the later stuff, and then get all the way through to the end, and that's how the saga concludes. Yeah. Well, there is a tiny part of me that wishes that I had read it that way, because the impact would have been so much greater. But ultimately, the way I consumed most of this stuff, and I don't know, it was probably the same. I mean, it's a long time since I read it, and I can't remember anything about it, but if I was reading a Brack the Barbarian story, or Thongor of Lemuria, or any of those things, I mean, they were mostly crap, but it didn't really matter. So I'm quite happy to consume my fantasy in that way, and I don't really desire things that are enormous arcs, like the Wheel of Time, or anything like that. So that kind of stuff doesn't interest me. I want something raw, fast-paced, exciting, visceral, and that'll do me. You made the point, how on earth do you consume this stuff? And I think it's to each their own. If you want it in sequence, great. I would suggest people just consume it in the way that most people consumed Michael Moorcock stuff in the 60s and 70s, or even the 80s. What you got in the charity shop? Which battered Mayflower edition of the Got on the Shelf? That's the one you should buy, and that's the one you should read.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm pretty sure I started. I couldn't remember the edition. Pardon me. It had Elric's face in close up on it. I think it was from somewhere in the 80s. It was Sailors. That was my first one. And what a start! Three funny little stories stitched together. But God, I love them, particularly the Gonzo one in the middle with the two siblings, the big weird siblings.
Agak and Magak. Yeah,
right, that was it. Yeah,
yeah. And actually, that's the one where the four aspects of the champion combine.
Yeah. And I didn't know what the fuck any of that was about, but I enjoyed the hell out of it. And then over time, I read Eternal Champion second. It was what was my first Eternal Champion one? Silver
Warriors.
Others. Thank you, Silver Warriors.
Yeah.
That was the first one. I enjoyed it. All right. You know, now I'm getting picky. I'm going to try and read things in order. I've only got the third Camp Brass story. I'm going to see if I can find the first two and then work through in order. But that's only after I've been initially excitedly gobbled up a bunch of whatever the hell I could find. And now I'm slowing me down and going, okay, all right, now I want to try and read some of it in order. So there you go. You find your own path, whatever works for you. But I think that's an attitude that is not as common as it used to be. And so maybe it's worth, I don't know, writing a non-fiction essay for the magazine. Maybe I should do that, about encouraging people. And that's the other thing too, right? Is just the assumptions, I'm hoping, this is my plan. I will have the mental bandwidth and time. I want to do some fun updates during the Kickstarter campaign to cover stuff so basic that I imagine most people listening to this podcast would go, why would you do that? But people know what this is. But I think, I'm going to do a short video because I am lucky. I have a lot of comfort with performing and editing and that kind of thing. So I'm going to do some short videos just from my desk to put as little updates on the Kickstarter, maybe one each weekend. I'll do 4 I'm thinking right now. One, literally just why sword and sorcery? Why would you give a shit? What's the difference? So I'll just try and cover that briefly and punchily and kind of some of the stuff we've talked about here. But another one after that, why even, I was like, how can I zoom out even more? Why short fiction magazine? I think there are people who legitimately don't think they exist or don't know, and it just hasn't occurred to them. And that's fine. They're not dumb. They're not, it's just not knowing. They're not what they used to be. Or, a video I want to remake. I made this back when issue 0 came out, and somebody asked the same question. Why hardcover? Why would you get a magazine in hardcover? And because that would have been me a year ago. It was pure chance. In June, when the magazine idea first cropped up, and I was like, what's it going to look like? And I was visiting my parents, and I looked over, what the hell is that? And I saw my dad was using as a mouse pad, for God's sake, not all of my family worship books, a copy of an American magazine from the 60s called Horizon. It had kind of a very classy, upscale National Geographic look to it. Anyway, it was in hardcover. I'd never seen it before in my life. A hardcover magazine. I pulled it out. It was big and beautiful, 3 columns of text, and all that stuff. And absolutely, that was me going, okay, this is the beginning of how we're going to figure out how this magazine looks. And I love the idea of how long this magazine, even with my father mistreating it, it survived. And there I am enjoying it all those years later. And I love that continuity of books. I mean, coming back to the Merril Collection, I love when I ask for something from their shelves to look at, and you find a marginalia, you find people writing their names in the corner, their book plates, writing "Happy Birthday, Jenny, 1978" on the inside or whatever. I mean, it's again that thing that the physical object gives you. Now, don't get me wrong, digital is important. We're always going to do digital. It's more financially accessible. It's good for people who need to use text-to-speech readers, that kind of thing. And it's great for people who live outside of the States because shipping, my God. So, digital has its uses, don't get me wrong, but I'm always going to love the physical object. So why hardcover? And the last one I want to do, honestly, this is going to sound funny on this podcast, but I'm going to do a video saying, well, I'm excited about Michael Moorcock. You can see, you'll see on the Kickstarter, I've given him a slightly bigger font, like a poster listing bands, because he's earned it, Christ. But some people are going to come in and they're people who've never seen Star Wars. So you're going to have people who don't know who the hell he is or why this Kickstarter campaign is excited about him. And so I want to do a short video where I'm going to do my best. I hope I don't shame myself. You'll be able to see it and tell for sure if anybody can. Just in a brief explanation of like, hey, here's who he is. Here's why you should be excited. That Game of Thrones thing, House of Dragon, Matt Smith. Well, he bears a passing resemblance to this other character, or some of these ideas, multiverse. You like that stuff with your Spider-Man everywhere? Guess what? And just because, and that's really just riffing off of what I was been doing for years with my volunteer work at the Merril Collection, because you have to draw these connections from past stuff or stuff that's not as well known now as it maybe was before, to the present, to the most common things you can, as long as you can do it like legitimately and sincerely, not being facile, because that's how you get people to care, and that's how you get them to start go, oh, maybe I will swim in those deep waters where you're sitting going, well, actually the publication order should be, this is how you gotta on-ramp them. So yeah, how'd I get there? Sorry, again, too much caffeine today, sorry folks, but
no, it's all good. You know what?
Yeah.
Remind us when the Kickstarter goes live.
Right, so the Kickstarter goes live February 2nd. It will go live as soon as I go flying out of my bed and run to my computer and press the button, because one thing I've learned is you cannot schedule launch a Kickstarter.
Right.
So if you're in England, you might not see it until noonish, depending on again on how early I get up and how early I press the big red button. But people in the Eastern Standard Time Zone, where I am, will probably see it go, I don't know, 7 a.m., something like that, maybe earlier, 6 a.m., let's be real. And so it'll run, for 30 days, starting February 2nd. And people who get in on day one, on one of the physical backer tiers, will be able to get an exclusive, just the first day backers bookmark featuring original art that I've commissioned from Sapro, one of the great artists we have on board, that will never be shown online or used in anything else. Literally just the bookmark. So what you're buying really is a nice little exclusive, super limited edition piece of art for your bookmark. And then people who back it, period, over the course of the Kickstarter, will be thanked in the issue number one. And that, of course, will not be the case with people who buy it later when it goes up in the shop that we'll be having online, assuming the Kickstarter funds. Because we want to print enough, we can keep selling them afterwards, right? And ideally, the issues will ship together, which I know is a bit funny, but it saves a lot on shipping for all parties. I'm hoping October. Maybe quicker if we can pull it off, but I don't want to overpromise. There's something else I would definitely say to anybody who wants to do something like this. Whatever timeline you're thinking of, add a month. Add a month or two. And if it goes quicker, great, but that's way better than the other way around. I said I would get issue 0 out sometime in September, and I did. September 30th. It was really tight. And even now, I'm happy I'm going for it. Like I said, it's launching February 2nd, but there's definitely a part of me that wouldn't mind another 4 weeks to do more promotion. So, we'll see how it goes. We'll see if it succeeds, but I'm feeling optimistic. We have a murderer's row of talented authors and artists, and we're taking everything, me and the guys on the staff, we're taking everything we've learned from putting out issue 0 into making an even better physical artifact and beautiful layout. Of course, will be benefited to the digital people as well. So yeah, you can find it, I guess, just by going to Kickstarter and searching for newedgeswordsorcery.com, although I, of course, have given you a link to chuck in the notes there. And if all else fails and you listen to this and you walk off and go, shit, where did he say? What the hell did Oliver? You can just go to newedgeswordsorcery.com. It'll have all the links, including the Kickstarter. Impossible to miss, I'm sure. I'm going to put a big graphic up. And if this goes well, my hope is to build on it. I want to do more issues of the magazine, obviously. I'm also thinking about doing like kind of anthology style issues of the magazine. So like, non-fiction, fiction art, all the same stuff I've described, but themed around romance or horror or whatever. I think I mentioned that a minute ago, pardon me. And then if we really get going, I would love to publish book-length anthologies and novellas. I'm such a big fan of novella, and the Sword and Sorcery works really well at that scale. I don't always think that the pacing of Sword and Sorcery works well at like longer novel lengths. But if you're doing, say, coming back to Sailors, that was 24,000 words, right? Pretty good novella length. I'd love to do my fantasy, my absolute fantasy, and I'll shut up for a second after I say this. It would be to do like a quarterly subscription of novellas, which would be available in digital and softcover to be, affordable, etc. But the big event there for me would be just to have the most beautiful hardcovers I could possibly assemble with all the trimmings. I'd love to get to do that. But first I got to find more issues of this magazine. So please do give it a shot, folks. I promise you won't regret it.
Well, I'll be back at it, and I'll be praying for the reading ribbon, because I'm a sucker for reading ribbons. I'm extraordinarily superficial when it comes to these things. I like hardback books, and I like reading ribbons. But before we go, I need you. It's a shame. You are a gamer, but you probably haven't got a D20 to hand, so I need you to pick a number between 1 and 20.
Oh my God, I have so many just in the other room. Oh, whatever. Okay, yeah. I'll pick a number.
Pick a number between 1 and 20, and I shall figure out. We're going to do this 3 times, and these are the patron demons who are going to receive a copy of issue 0 of New Edge Sword and Sorcery. So, go.
All right, well, let's put it down the middle. 10.
10. That will be Liam Jones. Liam J, I'll be sending you a copy of New Edge Sword and Sorcery issue 0. And again,
Brilliant. All right, let's give the critical failure some love. 1.
1. That will be going to Andy Clark, aka Clarky the Cruel. And our final number...
let's give it a DCC Warriors critical hit, which can come in at a 19.
19. That is Norman Beresford, the OG patron, who was our first ever patron on
brilliant. Well, you deserve it.
Yeah. So those 3 folks, keep an eye out on your post. An issue of... issue 0, I should say, of New Edge Sword and Sorcery magazine will be coming your way. Thanks for that, Oliver, and thanks for coming on and talking about this, and we hope to see you out there in the ether and wish you all the success in the world.
Thank you very much.
Massive thanks to Oliver for dropping by Derry Toms. Check out the show notes for links to his podcasts and other things we touched upon, including the Kickstarter for issues 1 and 2 of New Edge Sword and Sorcery magazine. And you can find Oliver on Twitter as @Brackenbury. In other news, Nand, our collaborator on the audio journals of The Wanderer Connolly, has completed and released Journal Volume 2, their second full album of sonic excursions into the spheres. As ever, it's deep, inspirational stuff and a big inspiration for me to kick on with writing Volume 3 of the journal. It's out now on Bandcamp. I'll link to it in the show notes and we'll play this show out with a choice cut, Domain of the Rocks. First though, thanks as always to our patrons, starting with those without tier, Anthony Paconti, Tim Cardos, Dave Dempster and Sebastian Weetabix. Next, our Chaos Engineers, Andrew Cicluna, Andrew Van Ness, Anthony Porter, Benjamin Fletcher, Dave Griffiths, Dave Voxman, James Knight, Jim Kirkland, John W. Lays, Jules Lawrence, Lee Gary, Mal Pertwee, Mary Catherine, Matt Saltz, Menyon, Nelbert, Paul McRandall, Ray Otis, Scott Butler, Simon Perrins, Tony Malazzo, and finally, I mentioned last time out that Sir Tancred Belforest, Queen's Champion, had boarded the Donblass. As is our wont, I dropped Sir Tancred a line and he got back to me to say, "Hi Andy, greetings from the second ether, brackets, North Devon. Thoroughly enjoy listening. You've captured something essential to the spirit of Mocock's work with this. Every episode is a treat. I think I arrived at Mocock through a combination of Howard, Chaikin, J.G. Ballard, Hawkwind and Alan Moore. Astounded by Pyatt and Cornelius, and worked my way in and around from there to the point of near obsession. Elric et al. Came a bit later, but I love it all the same. I think I typed in Mocock podcast one day thinking someone must be doing something these days, but what you're doing is above and beyond. One of the few perks of the times we live in is that such things can be put together and shared so widely. Cheers, Sir Tancred. Brackets, Patrick. Thanks for finding us tonight. We love being part of this community and being able to have these conversations, and thank you for that kind feedback too. It means everything. And of course, thanks to our crafty jugaderos, Alexander Harris, Ian Stead, Loz, Taylor, Matthew Broom, Toby White, Tom Murphy, Mark Hebden, Graham Holden, and Jason Connolly. And finally, eternal thanks to our patron demons, Andy Darby, Clarky the Cruel, Fred Quiche, Gareth Wilson, Gwen Barlow, Imria, Janie Stim, Jay Reeser, Joe Monty, Liam J, Miles Reed-Labato, Mort Main, Neil Burton, Paul Hillary, Randall Gatlin, Steve Round, the OG patron Norman Beresford, and last but never least, Robert McMillan. Right, enough yakking, we'll be back very soon, but for now, don't forget you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram with the handle @BreakfastRuins. You can email us at breakfastruins@outlook.com. The webpage is breakfastintheruins.com. We have our Patreon page too, there are a few extra odds and sods on there, but for now, take care, stay safe, we will meet again soon, on the Moonbeam Roads.